Somewhere in the first week of December 1941, a German reconnaissance unit pushed close enough to the northwestern edge of Moscow that its soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. They were roughly 12 miles from the city center, close enough that on a clear day the outline of the buildings was visible, close enough that some accounts described the men standing in the cold and simply looking. They did not move forward. They could not. The fuel in their vehicles had thickened in the cold. The lubricating oil in their rifle bolts had congealed. Their hands, inside gloves designed for a Central European autumn rather than a Russian winter that had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, could barely close around triggers. The closest the Wehrmacht ever came to Moscow was not a battle. It was a freezing halt. That halt is the hinge of this entire story, and it did not happen by accident. Operation Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow, had opened on the 1st of October 1941, with Army Group Center deploying roughly 78 divisions, nearly 1 million men, supported by around 1,700 tanks and over 600 aircraft. The Viasma and Bryansk encirclements that followed in the first 2 weeks swallowed an estimated 663,000 Soviet troops, 2 more catastrophic pockets in a campaign that had already consumed millions. Looking at October's numbers alone, the German advance seemed to confirm every timetable Hitler had set. Moscow appeared reachable before winter, and then the autumn rain turned the roads to mud that swallowed vehicles to their axles and held entire supply columns stationary for days at a stretch, and the window that had seemed open quietly began to close. The detail I find hardest to set aside, and I have spent a long time inside the logistics records for this campaign, cross-referencing German Army Group Center fuel returns against divisional strength reports, is not the cold itself, but the systematic underestimation that preceded it. The Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union in summer uniforms for a campaign its own logisticians had planned to last 3 to 4 months. By November 1941, the German army had already recorded roughly 100,000 frostbite cases before the deepest cold arrived. Panzer engines required heating for up to 2 hours before they would start in temperatures below minus 20. Hydraulic fluid in artillery recoil mechanisms froze and fractured the mechanisms themselves. The men fighting closest to Moscow were running on fractions of their authorized ammunition allocation because supply trains had stalled hundreds of kilometers behind them. On the 5th of December 1941, before the German offensive had fully stopped of its own accord, Georgy Zhukov, who had been placed in command of the Western Front in October specifically to hold Moscow, launched the Soviet counteroffensive. It hit a German line that had already been bled down to roughly 35% combat effectiveness in many of its frontline infantry divisions, according to Army Group Center's own assessments from that period. Soviet troops, including fresh divisions transferred from the Soviet Far East, after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack Siberia, were equipped for the temperature. They wore quilted winter uniforms, felt boots, and white camouflage suits. They attacked on skis across ground the German armor could not cross. The German line did not fracture immediately. It bent and then gave, losing ground measured first in dozens of kilometers and then in over 100 kilometers of retreat by January. German casualties at Moscow across the full battle ran between roughly 250,000 and 400,000 dead and wounded. Soviet losses were far heavier, somewhere between 600,000 and over 1 million, depending on the phase counted. But the Red Army recalibrated and held its capital, and Germany's army absorbed a kind of damage it had not experienced since the war began. A sustained, organized defeat by an enemy it had written off as nearly broken. Hitler responded by sacking his senior generals, including Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and taking personal command of the army himself. It was the first time in the entire European war that a German offensive had stalled, been pushed back, and stayed back. If the night is quiet around you now, and you are ready to let this settle, picture that reconnaissance patrol at the edge of Moscow in December, the spires visible through the cold air, the men not moving forward. Everything that followed in the next 3 years of the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, Kursk, the long retreat back through the same ground, grew out of what happened in those frozen weeks outside this single city. The whole story, from Typhoon's opening artillery to Zhukov's counteroffensive, is carried in this documentary from first frame to last. This is the entire history of the Battle of Moscow, Hitler's first defeat. To understand why Moscow happened the way it did, you have to start not in October, but in June. Not on the battlefield, but on a spreadsheet. Operation Barbarossa was built on a timeline, and that timeline was built on assumptions that were, in the summer of 1941, being quietly demolished. The original planning framework projected that Army Group Center would reach Moscow, or render it militarily irrelevant, within 9 to 17 weeks of the invasion's start. This was not optimism, it was a calculation. But calculations require correct inputs, and the inputs that went into Barbarossa's planning were drawn from a set of ideological preconceptions about Soviet military resilience that didn't survive contact with the actual Soviet Union. By week 10, mid-August, the Wehrmacht had already expended more men, fuel, and artillery ammunition than the planning documents projected for the entire campaign. The schedule had not merely slipped, it had already failed its own benchmarks before anyone in Berlin was prepared to say so publicly. What happened between June and September is a story within a story, and it matters enormously for understanding Moscow. Hitler made a decision in August 1941 to redirect Army Group Center's two panzer groups, the armored spearhead of the entire eastern offensive, away from the Moscow axis and toward Ukraine in the south, and toward the siege of Leningrad in the north. This is the famous Kiev diversion, and it is one of the most debated operational decisions of the entire war. The standard German memoir account, Guderian is the most vivid, most indignant, most self-serving narrator, presents this as Hitler overruling unified professional military advice. Guderian drove personally to Hitler's headquarters to argue against it. Halder's diary records his own opposition, and there's a real argument there. The Kiev operation consumed nearly 6 weeks that, in retrospect, constituted the margin between an autumn Moscow offensive and an autumn Moscow offensive conducted in the first frosts. But here is where I have to be honest about the other side of the argument. Military historian David Glantz, whose access to Soviet archives gives him a perspective unavailable to memoir-writing German generals, argues something more uncomfortable, that Army Group Center's logistics were already so degraded by late July that the Moscow route was essentially mechanically infeasible regardless of Hitler's decision. The men and tanks were there. The fuel and shells weren't. Whether the Kiev diversion killed the Moscow offensive, or whether the Moscow offensive was already terminal before the Kiev diversion, this is a real historiographical disagreement, and it cannot be resolved by simply quoting Guderian. What isn't debatable is the arithmetic. The 6th of September, 1941, Hitler issues Führer Directive No. 35, formally ordering the assault on Moscow. Typhoon is given a start date. It is to be completed before winter. The directive is a remarkable document for what it doesn't contain. There is no meteorological assessment attached to it, no supply analysis, no defined threshold for what would constitute mission failure. For a directive launching the largest single offensive operation in military history, this absence is not a minor clerical oversight. It is a structural statement about how the German Supreme Command understood its own plan, as something that would succeed because it was ordered to succeed, not because the conditions for success had been verified. That is not strategy. It is ideology in operational clothing. The supply problem requires a moment of technical attention, because it is easy to understand the Battle of Moscow emotionally and miss its mechanics. The Wehrmacht in the East in 1941 was simultaneously motorized and horse-drawn, a paradox that sounds like a bad joke until you understand the logistics. The armored spearheads, the panzer groups that made the headlines, ran on petrol, but the supply train that fed them, the artillery limbers, the ration wagons, the ammunition carts, was predominantly pulled by horses. There were approximately 300,000 of them in Army Group Center alone, and each animal required roughly 4.5 kilograms of grain per day. That's roughly 1,350 tons of forage every 24 hours, just to keep the animals alive. And this tonnage competed directly with fuel and shells on the same supply trains. Now add the gauge problem. German standard gauge railway track runs at 1,435 millimeters between rails. Soviet broad gauge track runs at 1,520 millimeters. From Brest-Litovsk eastward, every Soviet rail line the Wehrmacht was trying to use for resupply required either track regauging at a rate that German engineers estimated at approximately 20 kilometers per day in favorable conditions, or transshipment at temporary transfer points. The result was that Army Group Center's central supply artery, a single partially regauged line, had a theoretical carrying capacity of approximately 8 supply trains per day in October 1941. The minimum requirement for Typhoon operations, as calculated by Quartermaster General Wagner's staff, was 24 trains per day. The supply system was operating at roughly 33% of what the operation required before the first soldier moved east. On the 30th of September 1941, the attack began. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army jumped off 2 days ahead of the main axis, without full coordination with Army Group Center headquarters. His memoir frames this as tactical initiative. The OKH War Diary records it as an unauthorized deviation. Both things can be true simultaneously, and both reveal something about how the German military machine operated at this moment, with extraordinary tactical aggression and increasingly frayed operational coherence. The successes that followed in the next 2 weeks were real, and they were spectacular. The pockets at Viasma and Bryansk swallowed Soviet armies whole. On the 9th of October, Hitler's press chief Otto Dietrich held a press conference and declared the Soviet armies defending Moscow had been destroyed. German newspapers carried the headline, "The war in the East," Dietrich proclaimed, "was decided." The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, was already running out of fuel. What strikes me most about this opening phase, and I've spent a long time with Halder's diary and the supply records side by side, is not the military genius of the encirclements or the operational catastrophe of the German logistics. It's the parallel narratives. There is the public record, triumphant Wehrmacht communiques, Dietrich's press conference, the language of imminent victory. And there is Halder's private record, the August 11th entry, the growing list of supply deficits, the arithmetic that doesn't add up. These two narratives ran alongside each other for months, and the question of when the private record became too loud to ignore is essentially the question of when the Battle of Moscow was decided. The answer, I think, is earlier than most people believe. The Wehrmacht didn't run out of momentum in December when the temperature fell. It began running out of momentum in August, when the supply trains couldn't keep up, and it completed the process in October when the mud arrived. The cold was the final chapter of a book that had been written much earlier. Halder knew it. He wrote it down. The notebook is still there. The Führer directive of the 6th of September contained no failure criterion. This is the fact I keep returning to. In any responsible planning process, military or civilian, a plan that lacks a defined failure threshold is not a plan, it is a wish. When you don't specify what conditions will cause you to stop, what you are really saying is that you believe no conditions will stop you. That is a peculiarly dangerous form of confidence. And the calendar it produced, a Moscow offensive launched in late September, against a supply system running at a third of requirements, with winter arriving in weeks, was not a plan under any serious definition of the word. It was the arithmetic of defeat, written in schedule form, signed by a head of state who had told his generals that only ossified brains would think directly about Moscow, then reversed himself and ordered the direct Moscow offensive 6 weeks too late. The plan didn't die in the snow west of the Kremlin. It died in a German railway gauge office, in a logistics planning document that was read and filed and never shown to the man who was ordering the army forward. Chapter 2. A map that did not include roads. On the 27th of October, 1941, Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner filed a supply report. Wagner was not a combat general. He didn't lead charges or execute encirclements. He was an administrator, the man responsible for ensuring that the Wehrmacht's 3.5 million men in the East were fed, fueled, and armed. His reports are among the least read primary sources on the entire Eastern Front, and they are among the most revealing. In the report of October 27th, Wagner wrote that the roads shown on German operational maps do not exist in the form depicted. 4 weeks into the largest offensive of the war, the Quartermaster General of the German Army was telling his superiors that the physical infrastructure assumed by the entire Typhoon Plan had never actually existed. This wasn't a complaint about conditions. It was a report that the cartographic foundations of a multi-million-man operation were wrong. The maps the Wehrmacht used for the Moscow operation were based primarily on pre-revolutionary Russian cartographic surveys from the first decade of the 20th century, updated with aerial reconnaissance photography, but not ground-truthed for road surface conditions. This matters enormously. An aerial photograph can confirm that a road line exists. That is, that there is a linear clearing through forest connecting 2 points on a map. What aerial photography cannot confirm is whether that road consists of compacted gravel, corduroy log surfacing, seasonal dirt tracks that become impassable in wet weather, or simply a path worn into the soil by farm carts over generations. Soviet cartographic doctrine had for decades classified detailed road surface quality data as a state secret, a decision that seems almost bureaucratically absurd until you realize what it achieved in practice. The Germans invaded the Soviet Union carrying maps that showed roads which, in October 1941, could not carry trucks. The cartographic intelligence failure was, in a specific technical sense, also a Soviet intelligence success. The phenomenon that enforced this reality has a Russian name, rasputitsa. It translates approximately as the time of bad roads, or the roadless season, and it describes 2 annual periods, autumn and spring, when the freeze-thaw cycle turns the soil of central Russia into something between porridge and wet concrete, simultaneously impassable by wheeled vehicles and resistant to tracked ones. The first snow of the 1941 campaign fell on the 7th of October and quickly melted, and within days the main supply routes west of Moscow had transformed. Wagner's internal records show the compression happening in real time. In the first days of October, approximately 23 trucks per day were completing the resupply run from the Warsaw area to forward supply depots. By the 19th of October, that number had fallen to approximately 4. The supply line hadn't broken under enemy fire. It had slowly gelled into immobility, truck by truck, as vehicle after vehicle became embedded in mud that swallowed axles whole. German engineers attempted a response. Corduroy roads, log surface tracks laid over the worst sections of mud, were standard military engineering practice, and Army Group Center's engineering units began laying them along critical supply arteries almost immediately. The theoretical construction rate was approximately 12 kilometers per day per engineering unit in favorable conditions. I find the gap between that figure and the actual requirement almost impossible to comprehend without stopping to do the arithmetic. The area requiring surfaced road access in Army Group Center's operational sector was not 12 kilometers. It was not even 100 kilometers. The primary supply access alone required approximately 400 kilometers of improved road surface. You do not solve a 400-kilometer infrastructure problem with a construction rate of 12 kilometers per day. You watch the army slow and then stop, and you write reports about it to people who are not yet willing to hear them. There's a vehicle comparison here that illuminates the whole logistics picture in a way no general statistic can. The German army's primary supply truck in 1941 was the Opel Blitz, a reliable, well-built vehicle designed for European road conditions. Its ground clearance measured approximately 220 millimeters. The standard Soviet military truck, the ZS-5, a license-built derivative of an American design, had a ground clearance of approximately 235 millimeters, 15 millimeters, roughly the width of two adult fingers. In the mud conditions of October 1941, that 15mm difference was operationally decisive. The ZS-5 could crawl forward at 8 km per hour through mud that stopped the Opel Blitz completely. And the Soviet army, beyond its trucks, relied far more heavily on horse-drawn wagons for regimental-level supply. Wagons which, with their wide wooden wheels and lighter loadings, outperformed every motorized vehicle in deep mud without exception. The Wehrmacht had built a modern motorized supply system that was defeated in the autumn of 1941 by the horse-drawn supply logic of an earlier century. The Smolensk to Moscow highway, the one hardened road on the central axis, tells the story most starkly. This road could theoretically carry approximately 4,000 truck movements per day in reasonable conditions. Army Group Center's minimum supply requirement was approximately 12,000 truck movements per day. The arithmetic is simple and merciless. 2/3 of the Wehrmacht's supply requirement had no physical road to travel on, regardless of weather, regardless of vehicle type, regardless of the skill or determination of the drivers. When the mud arrived, that pre-existing deficit became catastrophic. When Wagner wrote that the roads on the maps didn't exist, he wasn't complaining about October rainfall. He was describing a planning failure that had been baked into the operation months before the first cloud appeared. The freeze arrived on the 15th of November. Roads hardened. Trucks moved again. The second phase of Operation Typhoon resumed, and for a brief period, Wagner's supply records show an improvement. Daily deliveries climbing from an October low back toward the mid-20s in train equivalents. The Germans pushed forward again, and most documentary treatments of the battle present this as a resumption of German strength, a second wind. But Wagner's annotations, written in the margins of his own supply summaries, tell a different story. The deficit accumulated during the 6-week rasputitsa period had never been cleared. The supply system was now delivering at approximately 60% of operational requirements, not 100%. The freeze had unblocked the trucks, but had not erased the hole in the supply ledger that October had dug. The army was advancing on borrowed time, toward a city it could not be adequately supplied to capture, on roads it didn't have enough of. With trucks running on fuel reserves, it was burning faster than it could replace. This is what military professionals mean when they describe an operation culminating. The momentum still exists. The material to sustain it doesn't. Chapter 3. Viasma. The pocket that swallowed 5 armies. Sometimes the Wehrmacht at its peak is almost difficult to argue with. In the first 10 days of October 1941, Army Group Center executed what the German operational maps, those maps that did not include the roads, showed with geometric precision. 2 massive panzer pincers, one driving southeast and one driving northeast, swinging shut around the better part of 5 Soviet armies west of Moscow, in a pocket near the town of Viasma, while a simultaneous encirclement closed around Soviet forces near Bryansk to the south. The speed of it was shocking even to the Germans who were executing it. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups met near Viasma on approximately the 7th of October. Entire Soviet armies, the 16th, the 19th, the 20th, the 24th, elements of the 32nd, found themselves encircled in a trap they hadn't fully understood was closing until it had already closed. The German war diaries from the 46th Panzer Corps during this period use the word präzise, precise, repeatedly. The encirclement was, by almost any operational standard, a masterpiece. Understand the Soviet situation from the inside. Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the 16th Army, learned his forces were encircled not from an intelligence report, not from a command communication, but because his artillery units reported that their shells were falling on Red Army soldiers from two directions simultaneously. The geometry of catastrophe announced itself through friendly fire. The Soviet Western Front's own records, communication logs released and published in a Russian military journal in the 1990s, show a 14-hour period on the 8th of October during which Front Commander Konev sent 7 separate radio messages to Moscow, requesting authorization to withdraw. None received an answer. The silence wasn't a technical failure. Stalin was declining to acknowledge that 5 armies were encircled. The command system had frozen in the face of a scale of disaster it wasn't built to process. The German propagandists moved faster than the commanders. On the 9th of October, Otto Dietrich stood before the International Press Corps and, quoting Hitler directly, announced that the Soviet armies defending Moscow had been destroyed. The war in the East was decided. The newspapers printed it. In London, in Washington, in neutral capitals, the headlines ran. There is something almost forensic about reading Dietrich's press conference transcript against the OKH supply reports from the same week. The triumphalist public language and the quietly catastrophic private logistics data running on parallel tracks, each apparently unaware of the other. The propaganda machine had declared victory. The quartermaster's office was running out of fuel to transport the ammunition. How many Soviet soldiers were actually captured in the 2 pockets? Here, the archive becomes genuinely contested, and it's important to say so clearly. German OKW communiques from October claimed 663,000 prisoners between Viasma and Bryansk combined. The figure was released publicly, cited internationally, used as evidence of Soviet army destruction. More recent scholarship, Glantz's comprehensive reassessment drawing on Soviet records, revises this downward to approximately 514,000. That's a discrepancy of roughly 149,000 people, the equivalent of about 15 Soviet divisions. The higher figure served a specific purpose. It supported Hitler's press conference claim that the war was decided. The lower figure, still an enormous military catastrophe by any measure, is more consistent with what actually happened next, which was that the Soviet Union reconstituted its defensive forces around Moscow with a speed that German planners had declared impossible. You can't reconstitute military capacity at that speed from nothing. You reconstitute it from the remnants and escapees that a slightly lower prisoner total implies. Those escapees matter enormously. Approximately 200,000 Soviet soldiers made their way out of the Viasma pocket in small groups, platoons, companies, in some cases entire regiments, that fought outward rather than inward, moving through forest and marshland at night, using terrain the encircling German infantry couldn't easily follow. These weren't raw conscripts. They were soldiers who had been fighting since the 22nd of June, who understood how German armour moved and where it was weakest, who had learned, at terrible cost, what Soviet infantry could actually achieve against a panzer division in prepared positions. When they emerged from the forests east of Viasma and reported to collecting points, these men became the backbone of the reserve divisions being assembled to defend Moscow. The pocket had inadvertently produced something the German planners hadn't accounted for: a large body of combat-experienced, deeply motivated soldiers who had already survived encirclement once and were not inclined to be encircled again. There's an accounting problem built into the German success at Viasma that I find genuinely fascinating and almost never discussed at the level it deserves. Eliminating the pocket required 28 German infantry and panzer divisions to form and hold the ring. 28 divisions. While they were doing that, while they were the ring keepers, the pocket reducers, they were not advancing toward Moscow. The same units could not simultaneously contain a 600,000-man pocket and press the offensive eastward. The Wehrmacht simply didn't have the manpower to do both at full speed. And so the most spectacular German operational success of the entire Typhoon campaign, the encirclement that looked like final victory, was simultaneously the thing that consumed the irreplaceable 6 weeks between early October and mid-November. The weeks when the roads still occasionally worked and the temperature hadn't yet turned murderous. The geometry of the victory was beautiful. The opportunity cost of winning it was the campaign itself. By the time the pockets were reduced and the German advance resumed toward Moscow, several things had changed. The mud had arrived. The supply deficit had deepened beyond recovery. And behind the German advance, in the forests and staging areas east of Moscow, something was being assembled that the German intelligence service had categorically failed to predict. Fresh divisions, properly equipped for winter, arriving by rail from the east. The men in white camouflage suits. The answer to the question of where they came from will take us to a spy in Tokyo, a rail network in Siberia, and a decision made on the 15th of October in the Kremlin that came within hours of going very differently. None of that was visible from the tactical perspective of a 46th Panzer Corps war diary entry using the word précis. The encirclement was precise. What it missed was everything happening outside its own geometry. Chapter 4. Mud, Horses, and the Collapse of the Metric System. Eduard Wagner had a problem that his superiors didn't want to hear about, and the way he documented it tells you almost everything you need to know about how the German High Command processed unwelcome information in 1941. His supply summaries, the daily accounting of trains delivered, tons received, consumption rates, vehicle availability, were submitted up the chain regularly, on schedule, in proper format. Internally, in the annotations he kept in a separate file, he tracked the gap between what the army required and what the army was receiving, with a precision that becomes more painful the closer you read it. By the 25th of October, Army Group Center was receiving 27 supply trains per day. The daily requirement at face value was 31. An 87% fulfillment rate sounds almost acceptable. What Wagner's internal annotations reveal is that the 31 train requirement had itself been revised downward from 51 trains 3 weeks earlier, when it became clear that 51 trains was operationally impossible. The Wehrmacht's logistics reporting had begun measuring success against a target it had already secretly lowered. The numbers on the summary looked tolerable. The actual situation they described was not. The horse question receives almost no attention in popular histories of the Moscow campaign, and this is a significant gap in understanding. The German army of 1941 was not the mechanized juggernaut that its promotional imagery, the panzer columns, the motorized infantry, the Stuka formations, suggested. At the armored spearhead, yes, it was a modern force. But feeding that spearhead, moving the artillery that supported the infantry that consolidated the panzer gains, the Wehrmacht depended on approximately 300,000 horses in Army Group Center alone. Each horse required approximately 4.5 kilograms of grain per day to remain operational. 300,000 horses, 4.5 kilograms each. That is approximately 1,350 tons of forage every single day. Not as a one-time cost, every day. This tonnage competed on the same trains, for the same wagon space, with ammunition and fuel. Every wagon carrying horse grain was a wagon not carrying artillery shells. By late October, with rasputitsa destroying the roads and the supply trains already running at a fraction of required capacity, the horses were dying at a rate of roughly 1,000 per week across Army Group Center. The losses degraded artillery mobility, which degraded fire support, which degraded the infantry's ability to advance. The supply system collapse wasn't a single dramatic event. It was this kind of cascading, interlocking, grinding arithmetic of insufficiency. Here is something the German post-war memoir literature consistently obscures because it points directly at procurement failure rather than battlefield heroism or Hitler's interference. The Wehrmacht knew, before Typhoon began, that its standard-issue lubricants would fail in deep Russian winter. This isn't a retrospective observation. A Wehrmacht ordnance review conducted in September 1941, documented in German military records, identified that standard lubricants would become operationally ineffective below approximately -15 degrees Celsius. A procurement order for Arctic-grade lubricants was issued in response. That order was not fulfilled by December 1941 due to production capacity constraints. The army also knew, before Typhoon began, that winter uniforms had been produced for only approximately 30% of Eastern Front strength. Guderian's memoir blames the uniform shortage on supply trains stuck in Poland. Captured German procurement records, cross-referenced after the war, indicate the winter clothing was never manufactured in sufficient quantities to begin with. The shortage was a production failure, not a logistics failure. The distinction matters enormously because it locates the failure not in the general's chain of command, but in the regime's wartime industrial planning. Guderian's narrative conveniently moves the blame from the procurement desk to the supply depot. The production records don't support him. The Opel Blitz versus the ZIS-5, the corduroy roads, the horse grain. These details matter because they reveal a military organization whose sophistication was concentrated at its cutting edge and hollow in its infrastructure. The panzer divisions, the air support doctrine, the encirclement operational art, these were genuinely world-class. The supply system feeding them was a 19th century organization with a 21st century appetite. And when those two things came into friction in the mud of October 1941, it wasn't the 20th century that won. It was the mud. It wasn't even the Russian mud specifically. It was the mud of a logistics system that had been designed for a 6-week sprint and was being asked to sustain a 6-month war. The freeze of the 15th of November seemed, briefly, like salvation. Temperatures dropped, the mud hardened, trucks could move again. Wagner's delivery records show a brief improvement in train arrivals, from an October low of approximately 18 per day up toward the mid-20s. The second phase of Operation Typhoon resumed. The panzers advanced. For a few days, it looked like the momentum had returned. But here is what the freeze could not undo. The supply deficit accumulated during 6 weeks of rasputitsa was roughly 102,000 tons. Clearing that deficit at the improved delivery rates now available would have taken approximately 34 days. The German army had perhaps 3 weeks before the deep freeze of a Russian winter would make sustained offensive operations impossible for entirely different reasons. The mathematics of recovery didn't fit inside the calendar of opportunity. The freeze gave the army 60% of what it needed on a schedule that required 100% in a window that was already closing. There was no version of November that ended well. What I find most instructive about the entire logistics story, and I come back to this point because it seems to me the single most underappreciated element of the Battle of Moscow, is that Wagner's internal assessments were reaching the right people. Halder knew. The army commanders knew. The supply deficit was documented, analyzed, and reported through proper channels. The information existed. What didn't exist was a mechanism for transmitting that information to Hitler in a form that would change his operational decisions. The German High Command had, by the autumn of 1941, developed what you might call a cultural allergy to unwelcome arithmetic. The official summaries were adjusted. The requirements were revised downward. The numbers on the page were made to look acceptable. And the army moved forward anyway, into an operation it could not be adequately supplied to complete, carrying maps that didn't include the roads. Chapter 5. The Moscow Panic. 16 hours in October. There is a document in the Russian State Archive that was classified for almost 50 years. State Defense Committee document number 34, dated the 15th of October 1941, is not a battle plan. It is not an order of battle. It is a demolition order. It authorizes the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to blow up industrial enterprises, warehouses, communications infrastructure, and, in the event that German forces reach the gates of Moscow, the entire electrical system of the Moscow Underground Railway. It also contains a sentence about the leadership's movement plans. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet and the top levels of government are to evacuate east to Kuibyshev on the Volga. And then, Comrade Stalin will leave tomorrow or later, depending on the situation. This is the document that proves how close the Soviet state came, on the 15th of October 1941, to something that might be described as its own collapse. Not military collapse. The army was still fighting. Institutional collapse. The kind that happens when the leadership decides the city cannot be held, and the signal that it has given up reaches the population before the population has been told it should give up. The Viasma-Bryansk disaster had opened a gap in the Soviet defensive line that, on paper, should have been unrecoverable. The road to Moscow was defended by fewer than 100,000 troops. The government ministries began receiving orders to relocate. Stalin's communications equipment and personal documents were packed aboard his train, waiting at a Moscow railway station. His personal telegraphist, Nikolai Ponomaryev, was driven from the Kremlin to the station in a car and told to wait. Ponomaryev later recalled seeing the armoured train, Stalin's guards on the platform, and understanding that he was about to go into evacuation. Anastas Mikoyan, a Politburo member, later wrote that Stalin told him directly on the 15th of October that he intended to leave the following day. The train was loaded. The decision, as far as anyone around Stalin could tell, had been made. What happened next on the streets of Moscow is one of the most surreal episodes of the entire war. Word leaked, not through an official announcement, but through the networks of rumour and half-information that operate faster than any government communication. Shop owners began distributing their stock to customers and passers-by, reasoning that German soldiers would take everything in any case. The roads east of the city filled with people, workers, families, officials, attempting to leave by any means available. NKVD internal reports from the 16th of October recorded factory workers refusing to report for their shifts, having heard that the government was already gone. There were rumours, circulating widely, that German forces had actually entered the western suburbs. Vladimir Ogrysko, an NKVD commander deployed to restore order on the streets, later gave testimony that captures the atmosphere with a directness that I find almost uncomfortable to sit with. He described his orders simply: "You shoot them on the spot." He used the word heroic to describe this. That word choice, recorded in a Soviet military journal in 1991, tells you something about the moral framework within which the Soviet state understood its own coercion. Stalin didn't leave. He reversed course. The train was unpacked. His Kremlin office reopened. The exact moment at which the reversal occurred, whether it was a single decision or a gradual process over the 16th and 17th of October, is genuinely unclear in the documentary record. And the Soviet-era historians who insisted Stalin never seriously planned to leave are contradicted too directly by Mikoyan's account and Ponomaryev's testimony to be credible. What we do know is that on the 19th of October, Stalin chaired a Politburo meeting and did something psychologically remarkable. He went around the table and asked each member in turn whether Moscow should be defended. He didn't state his own position. He watched each face. Each member, presumably calculating that their leader wanted to hear a particular answer, agreed to defend the city. Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police, who had told his colleagues before the meeting that We have absolutely nothing at all. We have been overwhelmed and are being shot down like partridges. Looked Stalin in the eye and agreed to stay and fight. The city entered a state of siege. The NKVD used maximum force to restore order, quickly and publicly. The decision to stay mattered beyond its psychological symbolism, and it's worth being specific about why. Robert Citino, the American military historian, put it directly in his analysis. Stalin had spent the previous 15 years eliminating everyone who might have constituted an alternative center of political gravity in the Soviet Union. The Soviet regime, as it existed in late 1941, was not a structure that could survive the removal of its capstone without something catastrophic happening to its load-bearing walls. Other analysts have made the point more cautiously. Robert Service, in his Stalin biography, notes that Stalin staying was very important for morale, while acknowledging that the decision was genuinely uncertain right up to the last moment. Simon Sebag Montefiore argues the decision was totally decisive because Russia was collapsing. I sit closer to Citino's position. The Soviet state in October 1941 was not a political system that would have continued functioning in an organized way, with its leader hundreds of miles away in the Ural foothills. Whether that means Moscow would have fallen without Stalin's presence is a different question. But the institutional continuity that made a military recovery possible in November and December depended on the political signal that the 16th of October had nearly cancelled. On the 7th of November 1941, Revolution Day, the anniversary of the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917, Stalin held a military parade in Red Square. Troops in full kit marched from beneath the Kremlin walls to the front lines north and west of the city. It was announced on Soviet radio after it had already begun, deliberately timed to prevent Luftwaffe interception. Foreign correspondents transmitted footage worldwide. The effect on Soviet morale, on neutral states, on German intelligence assessments, was disproportionate to its military significance. It was a performance of institutional confidence in a month when institutional confidence was nearly the only resource left in the Soviet inventory. Foreign observers who had been privately predicting Moscow's fall within days saw the parade footage and revised their assessments. German intelligence, which had been tracking signs of Soviet government collapse, noted the parade with concern. It was not the parade of a government preparing to abandon its city. It was the kind of thing a government does when it has decided, definitively, that it is going to fight. Chapter 6. Zhukov's appointment, a man summoned from disgrace. On the 10th of October, 1941, at 2:30 in the morning, a telephone rang in the office of General Georgy Zhukov. The caller was Stalin. The Stavka telephone log records the opening of the call. Comrade Zhukov, what is the situation on the Western Front? Zhukov had been in command of the Western Front for approximately 18 hours. In those 18 hours, he had already conducted 3 personal reconnaissance trips to the forward positions. His answer to Stalin's question included the phrase, "The situation is critical." In an archive filled with euphemisms, deflections, and the careful language of men who had watched what happened to Soviet officers who told Stalin unwelcome truths, this may be the most straightforwardly honest sentence spoken directly to Stalin during the entire Battle of Moscow. It was honest because Zhukov was a man who had already paid the institutional price for honesty and had apparently decided that the price, once paid, freed him to continue. 3 months earlier, Zhukov had been chief of the General Staff, the highest professional military position in the Soviet Union. He was removed on the 29th of July, 1941. The reason? He had recommended that Kiev could not be held and had advised a strategic withdrawal. Stalin called the suggestion rubbish. Zhukov offered to resign rather than sign operational orders he considered wrong. He was reassigned to command the reserve front, a demotion so public and so pointed that everyone in the Soviet military command understood exactly what it signified. The Kiev disaster that followed vindicated Zhukov's analysis with extraordinary precision. 665,000 Soviet prisoners by September, exactly the encirclement he had predicted. The man who'd been demoted for saying it would happen watched it happen from the reserve front, said nothing for the public record, and waited. When the October crisis made every other option worse, Stalin called him. What Zhukov found when he arrived at Western Front headquarters at Perkushkovo, west of Moscow, was a command structure in a state of near paralysis. General Konyev, who had presided over the Viasma encirclement, both as a participant in the catastrophe and as a man who had watched 5 armies disappear while his radio messages to Moscow went unanswered, was present for the handover. Staff officers from both men's commands left accounts of this transition that disagree in their details, but agree in their atmosphere. The tension was severe, the uncertainty complete, and the institutional damage from the previous 2 weeks was visible on every face in the room. Zhukov assessed the situation, filed his first reinforcement request to Stavka within 48 hours, and received a refusal with the annotation, "Impossible." He filed the same request again 2 days later, with one additional sentence. "Without these reinforcements, I cannot hold the front." They were granted. The operational concept Zhukov applied to the Moscow defense is worth understanding specifically because it wasn't obvious, and the historians who have studied it most carefully, David Stahel's work is the most technically rigorous, argue it represented a genuinely non-standard approach to a situation that standard doctrine would have handled differently. The Mozhaisk defensive line, running roughly 220 kilometers from Volokholamsk in the north through Mozhaisk to Maloyaroslavets in the south, was the last organized Soviet defensive position before Moscow's outer suburbs. Conventional doctrine would have concentrated the best available forces on this line to hold it as long as possible. Zhukov chose to hold it with understrength formations, units that would absorb punishment and delay rather than stop, while keeping his limited reserves behind the line rather than in it. He was not trying to hold the Mozhaisk line. He was trying to buy time, specifically the time for 2 things: the arrival of fresh formations from the east and the continued attrition of German offensive capacity. He was watching the German supply situation with the attention of a man who understood that an army running at 33% of supply requirements was not an army that could sustain indefinite pressure. The specific tactical innovation he introduced, deploying anti-tank rifle brigades at road junctions in what Soviet doctrine called pack front configurations, clusters of anti-tank guns and rifles supported by light infantry at prepared positions, was adapted directly from German anti-tank doctrine. Zhukov had studied German military theory with genuine attention. The pack front positions at the critical road junctions west of Moscow forced German armor off the roads and into the adjacent mud and forest, where it was slowed by terrain rather than firepower, where the Panzer Division's speed advantage evaporated. German armor that could not bypass these positions at speed and had to reduce them frontally was armor consuming fuel it couldn't replace, and ammunition that wasn't arriving fast enough. Every hour a panzer battalion spent trying to reduce a pack front junction at Volokholamsk was an hour it wasn't driving toward Moscow. Zhukov wasn't trying to defeat the Wehrmacht tactically. He was trying to run out its clock. Antony Beevor, in his analysis of the Moscow defense, argues that the structural defensive preparations already underway, the anti-tank ditches, the defensive lines, the civilian militia, gave the Soviet position a resilience that would have presented significant problems to the German offensive even without Zhukov's specific contributions. He has a point. By October 1941, 600,000 Moscow civilians, the majority of them women, because most able-bodied men had been conscripted, had been organized into labor brigades and were digging anti-tank ditches and earthwork positions in a great arc around the city. 90,000 soldiers were deployed in the city itself. These preparations existed before Zhukov's appointment and were not primarily his creation. Where I find Stahil's counter-argument more persuasive is in the specific tactical adjustments, the reserve placement, the pack front doctrine, the decision to accept tactical defeats at the Mozhaisk line in exchange for preserving mobile reserves for the moment of German exhaustion. These choices had a quality to them that depended on the specific military judgment of a specific person, and not every Soviet commander available in October 1941 would have made them. Rokossovsky would have. Konev, on the evidence of October, probably wouldn't have. Me, I find myself returning again and again to the personal dimension of Zhukov's situation in a way that doesn't reduce to either heroism or institutional analysis. This was a man who had already told his supreme commander the truth once, been punished for it, watched his prediction come true at catastrophic cost to his country, and then agreed to come back and fight for the same system under the same commander. The word loyalty doesn't quite cover it, neither does pragmatism. It might be something more specific to the Soviet experience, the recognition that the choice between fighting and not fighting had already been made at a level above any individual's capacity to reverse it, and that within the remaining choices, some were better than others. Zhukov chose the ones that kept the army alive and kept it mobile and kept it capable of striking when the German momentum finally ran out. He did this without adequate supplies, without the reinforcements he had requested and been denied, in a command structure that had just publicly failed, in a capital city that had just come within hours of being abandoned by its own government. The operational skill is undeniable. The circumstances in which it was exercised deserve to be stated plainly. By late November, Zhukov's own notebook, fragments of which were published in Russian military journals after 1991, contained an entry for the 28th of November that has been translated various ways but reads approximately, "If the Germans come 3 more kilometers, there is nothing left to give them." The German advance was at its closest point. The Siberian divisions were already on the trains heading west. December 5th was 9 days away. Chapter 7. The Secret Intelligence that Unlocked Siberia. There is a transmission that changed the course of a war. Not a military order, not a battle plan, not a diplomatic communique from a head of state. A single intelligence report, encoded and transmitted from Tokyo to Moscow by a German journalist who had spent nearly a decade living a double life in one of the most surveilled cities on Earth. On the 14th of September 1941, Richard Sorge advised Soviet military intelligence that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union that year. He was arrested by Japanese counterintelligence 34 days later, on the 18th of October. By the time the Japanese police came for him, the intelligence he had just transmitted was already altering the strategic balance of a battle 3,000 miles to the west. A battle Sorge would never learn the outcome of in a country that would not officially acknowledge his existence for 20 more years. To understand what Sorge's message made possible, you have to first understand what was sitting idle east of the Urals while Moscow burned through its reserves. The Soviet Far Eastern Military District and the Transbaikal Military District maintained substantial forces to guard against a Japanese attack from Japanese-occupied Manchuria. These weren't second-line garrison units. They were combat-ready formations that had been on operational alert since the summer, equipped and supplied, trained for conditions that, it turned out, were identical to the conditions now prevailing west of Moscow. Moving any significant part of this force required answering a single question that Soviet intelligence could not answer with confidence from open sources alone. Was Japan going to strike northward into Siberia, or southward toward the American and British possessions in the Pacific? The answer to that question was not available in any public record. It required sources inside Japan's government. Sorge had them. His primary source was a man named Hotsumi Ozaki, a Japanese journalist and cabinet-level policy advisor whose access to the upper levels of Tokyo's decision-making process was, from a pure intelligence standpoint, extraordinary. Ozaki had been part of Sorge's network for years. Through the summer and autumn of 1941, as the Japanese Imperial Conference debated the fundamental question of strategic direction, Ozaki fed information through the network to Sorge with a precision that reads, in retrospect, like a carefully placed wire inside the Japanese government's most sensitive deliberations. By August, the network was confident that Japan was orienting southward. By September, Sorge transmitted what his own later account described as a definitive assessment. Japan's military planners had chosen the southern option. They were going for the American and British Pacific possessions. They were not going north into Soviet territory. Not that year. Now here is where the historical picture becomes more complicated than the popular version allows, and I think it's important to say so directly. The notion that Sorge's intelligence single-handedly unlocked a flood of battle-hardened Siberian divisions that rushed west to save Moscow is, as a piece of documentary research published by the operational history website operationbarbarossa.net, has argued with considerable rigor, substantially a myth. The detailed tracking of every division that actually transferred west from Soviet eastern districts to the Moscow area reveals a picture considerably less dramatic than the legend. Only a small number of rifle divisions with genuinely Siberian personnel were transferred to the Western Front, defending Moscow in the October-November period. The majority of the forces that stopped the German advance and launched the December counteroffensive were newly mobilized divisions, units raised from the general Soviet population through the massive mobilization program of the second half of 1941, which was the largest single wartime mobilization in history by almost any measure. Those aren't Siberian divisions in any meaningful sense. They're Soviet divisions, raised and equipped at extraordinary speed across the breadth of the country. What Sorge's intelligence did contribute was the prerequisite decision to begin any eastward transfer at all, and the confidence to continue mobilizing and deploying without keeping excessively large reserves tied to the Far Eastern border. The operational question was not simply, can we move the Siberian divisions? It was, how aggressively can we denude the eastern frontier and commit everything available to the Moscow front? That calculation required intelligence about Japanese intentions, and Sorge provided it. But the divisions that answered the December counteroffensive's requirements were overwhelmingly new formations raised in the second half of 1941, not veteran transfers from the Far East. When German frontline soldiers in December 1941 encountered troops in white camouflage, well-fed and equipped for winter, and wrote in their regimental diaries about encountering formations of unfamiliar quality, they weren't necessarily meeting men from Vladivostok. They were meeting the product of Soviet mobilization on a scale that German intelligence had categorically failed to predict. This distinction matters for how we understand the battle, because the Siberian Division legend, as appealing as it is narratively, slightly obscures what was actually the more extraordinary achievement: the Soviet Union's capacity to mobilize, equip, train, and field over 180 new rifle divisions in 6 months, while simultaneously losing hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of pieces of equipment in the catastrophic defeats of the summer and autumn. The mobilization was the real military miracle. The individual divisional transfers were a contributing factor. Sorge made the latter possible and somewhat easier. He didn't produce the former. The Soviet system, with all its coercive brutality, produced it. What Sorge himself knew about any of this is unclear. He was arrested on the 18th of October, in the middle of the Battle of Moscow. He sat in a Japanese prison for 3 years, was tried for espionage, and was executed by hanging at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo on the 7th of November, 1944. The date is grimly ironic. The 7th of November is Revolution Day, the anniversary of the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917. The same day Stalin had held his Red Square parade 3 years earlier. The parade that the intelligence Sorga had spent years collecting had helped make possible. His last words, delivered in fluent Japanese to his captors, were, "Long live the Red Army. Long live the Soviet Union." He was hanged shortly after. Stalin never made any official move to exchange him, acknowledge him, or save him. The Soviet state did not publicly confirm Sorga's existence or significance until 1964, 20 years after his death, when he was posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, in a ceremony his family could not attend because they were living in Germany. The man who contributed materially to the intelligence underpinning of Moscow's defense died without knowing whether the city had held, in a prison run by the country he had been spying on, unacknowledged by the country he had been spying for. History, on occasion, operates with a very specific kind of cruelty. Chapter 8. 20 kilometers. The view from the wire. Stop the statistics for a moment. Put down the supply tables, the rail gauges, the tonnage deficits. There's a letter in a documentary archive that matters more than any of them right now. It was written by a German infantry corporal, identified only by initials in the source collection, sometime around the 28th of November, 1941. It says, "We can see Moscow from the hill. Someone in the regiment says it is the church domes. No one goes to look. No one goes to look." That is the sentence I keep returning to, because it contains something that no operational summary can. The texture of an army that has reached the absolute boundary of what human bodies and human will can sustain, standing at the edge of what is supposed to be their objective, and collectively choosing not to confirm it. Not from cowardice, from exhaustion that has gone so deep it has become indifference to the very thing they were sent to achieve. By late November 1941, the German forces closing on Moscow from multiple directions had been in continuous offensive operations for almost 60 days since the start of Typhoon, and for over 5 months since the 22nd of June. The 4th Panzer Group had pushed to within approximately 20 kilometers of the city boundary. The 3rd Panzer Group had crossed the Moscow-Volga Canal at Dmitrov, roughly 37 kilometers to the north. Near a suburb called Krasnaya Polyana, to the northeast, German positions stood approximately 20 kilometers from the Kremlin, a distance that, by the geography of modern Moscow's metropolitan sprawl, now falls squarely inside the city's commuter zone. The high watermark of Hitler's military power against the Soviet Union is today a quiet residential district of apartment blocks and weekend markets. There is a war memorial at the site. The suburb is unremarkable. This compression of historic catastrophe into ordinary urban geography is one of the stranger experiences available to any visitor to modern Moscow. What German soldiers were actually experiencing at those positions in late November has been reconstructed from memoirs, after-action reports, and the testimony collected by documentary historians, including Lawrence Rees. The picture that emerges doesn't resemble the myth of unstoppable German warriors, stalled only by weather. By the 1st of December, temperatures on the Moscow front had reached -20 to -30 degrees Celsius. German standard-issue rifle bolts were freezing in the cold. Artillery recoil mechanisms, which depend on hydraulic fluid maintaining liquid viscosity, were seizing. Machine gun lubricants, formulated for Central European winter conditions adequate to roughly -15 degrees, were becoming too thick to allow cycling mechanisms to function. German divisional medical records from this period. The 258th Infantry Division's report is particularly stark. Record over 1,200 frostbite casualties in a single division in a 72-hour period. Not combat wounded. Frostbite. Men whose toes and fingers had been destroyed by temperature because their boots and gloves were designed for a campaign that was supposed to have ended in October. The Soviet Valenki, traditional knee-height Russian felt boots, pressed from dense wool, worn by Red Army infantry since before the revolution, maintained functional warmth at -40 degrees Celsius without additional insulation. German standard-issue jackboots, with their ankle-height leather construction and single wool sock lining, were adequate to approximately -15 with careful layering. That gap, 25 degrees of cold weather operability, was the difference, at the individual soldier level, between a man who could maintain position and fight and a man who was managing a medical emergency every time he stood still for more than an hour. German soldiers who managed to capture Soviet Valenki, from prisoners, from the dead, from abandoned positions, wore them. Regimental reports note with some frequency that units lucky enough to acquire Soviet winter footwear suffered dramatically lower cold injury rates. The boots of the enemy were more useful than the boots of the supply chain. The closest the German army came to Moscow in a literal reconnaissance sense was on the 2nd of December, when a German reconnaissance unit operating near Khimki, a northern suburb then at the edge of Moscow's administrative boundary, reached positions from which, according to Imperial War Museum records, officers could observe Moscow's city outlines through field glasses. 16 kilometers from the Kremlin, as the crow flies. Whether any particular officer actually saw Kremlin towers through binoculars is a question that the sources don't resolve cleanly. The accounts of what was visible from which positions vary enough to suggest the spires of the Kremlin story may have grown somewhat in the retelling. What's not in question is that German reconnaissance units were operating inside what is now the administrative boundary of Greater Moscow. That is a documented geographic fact. Behind the German front line, on the Soviet side, something was happening that neither German intelligence nor any German frontline soldier could directly observe. 600,000 Moscow civilians were digging. The majority were women. The city's men had been conscripted in waves, and the labor brigades now working the ring of anti-tank ditches around the city were built from school teachers, factory workers, university students, shop assistants. They worked in shifts, around the clock, with picks and spades in frozen ground, digging the arc of obstacles that ran in a great semicircle through Moscow's western and northern approaches. Soviet military engineers later credited these positions with materially slowing the armoured approach routes toward the city. Nobody gave those women a campaign medal, and the post-war commemorative literature absorbed them into a generalized narrative of people's heroism that smoothed over the individual reality. Hundreds of thousands of exhausted civilians in inadequate clothing, digging fortifications in frozen ground, in a city that their government had nearly abandoned 3 weeks earlier. The German advance had objectively slowed to a crawl. By early December, some panzer units were logging advances of 2 to 4 kilometers per day, operational tempos more consistent with the First World War than with the Blitzkrieg campaigns of France or the summer of 1941. The reason wasn't primarily combat resistance, though that was real. It was the accumulated compounding of every supply deficit, every equipment failure, every logistical shortfall that had been building since late September. A Panzer III needed to be warmed to start. The warming fires required fuel. The fuel wasn't arriving fast enough. Without the fires, the engine wouldn't turn over. Without the engine, the tank was a steel-walled shelter. And inside that shelter, men were trying to keep warm enough to remain operational in conditions they weren't equipped to survive, let alone fight in. By the end of November, the German army on the Moscow front had roughly 100,000 frostbite casualties. The Eastern Front as a whole had accumulated, by the turn of the year, approximately 100,000 cold injury cases that required medical treatment, more than 14,000 of which required amputations. These numbers come from German military medical records, not from Soviet propaganda. The German army was consuming itself. Chapter 9, December the 5th. The clock runs out for the attacker. There is a supply report filed 4 days before the Soviet counteroffensive began, and it contains a sentence that Eduard Wagner addressed to the German army's supply section. Not to Hitler, not to OKW, not to any audience that would have found it politically inconvenient. Wagner wrote, in his capacity as Quartermaster General, that the German army was at the end of its personnel and material strength. End of its strength. He didn't qualify it. He didn't attach a plan for improvement. The sentence is simply there, flat and final, in an administrative summary that went to the right desks and was read by the right people and changed nothing. Because the German command structure had long since lost its capacity to transmit information of this kind upward to the man whose decisions it needed to change. Von Bock acknowledged in a communication to OKH on approximately the 4th of December that Army Group Center's offensive capability was spent. For the first time in any official document of the Typhoon campaign, he used the German word Stellungskrieg, positional warfare, the defensive grinding of set positions, the antithesis of everything the Wehrmacht had been built to do. The age of blitzkrieg on the Eastern Front had quietly ended in a typed administrative report on a cold afternoon west of Moscow. The counteroffensive that began on the 5th of December was not what popular military history tends to depict. A vast, coordinated hammer blow delivered at a moment of perfect Soviet readiness. The picture is messier than that, and the mess is actually more instructive than the clean version. The Kalinin front, under General Konev, attacked first, at 0300 hours on the 5th of December, in -22 degrees Fahrenheit, deep snow, along the axis northwest of Moscow, against the exhausted 3rd Panzer Army. This attack began 24 hours before Zhukov's Western Front joined the offensive on the 6th. Soviet records describe the overall operation as coordinated. The individual timing, however, appears to have been driven partly by Konev's own assessment of the moment's readiness on his sector, a judgment that apparently wasn't fully synchronized with Zhukov's timeline in all its particulars. The official Soviet history of the counteroffensive smoothed this out. The memoirs of staff officers on both fronts preserve, in their disagreements about the timing, the faint outline of an operation that succeeded not because it was immaculately orchestrated, but because the German defense was too exhausted to absorb simultaneous shocks from multiple directions, regardless of their precise sequencing. When Zhukov's Western Front joined the attack on the 6th, the blow fell across approximately 200 kilometers of front simultaneously. The critical element is not the spatial scale, but the German response capacity. A defending force absorbs a counteroffensive most effectively when it has tactical reserves, uncommitted units that can be moved to reinforce threatened sectors, plug gaps, restore lines. By the 6th of December, Army Group Center had no significant tactical reserves. The divisions that might have filled this role had been fed into the forward attack for weeks. The units that remained in position were at fractions of their authorized strength, cold, undersupplied, holding lines without depth. When the Soviet attacks hit along a 200-kilometer front, there was nothing to send to the trouble spots. Every trouble spot was the front. The Katyusha rocket launchers, the BM-13, which Soviet soldiers called Katyusha after a popular song, and which German soldiers called Stalin's organ because of the sound they produced, played a specific psychological role in the opening salvos that went beyond their physical destructive effect. A single launcher could fire 16 132mm rockets in approximately 8 to 10 seconds. A battery of 4 launchers delivered 64 rockets in under 10 seconds, a wall of simultaneous explosions covering several hectares. The sound and visual effect of a battery salvo, heard by German frontline troops who had no comparable weapon and no instinctive counter-battery response, was described in multiple German after-action reports from this period as disorienting in a way that conventional artillery wasn't. Conventional artillery arrives in rounds, sequentially. A Katyusha salvo arrives all at once, like a sudden change in the nature of the air. German soldiers wrote about it specifically, and the consistency of the accounts suggests it was operationally significant in those first hours. On the 8th of December, Hitler issued his famous halt order. German forces were to hold their current positions. No large-scale withdrawals. This order was opposed unanimously by every senior field commander. Von Kluge, who had replaced the ailing von Bock as Army Group Center commander on the 19th of December, described the situation in personal correspondence as a catastrophe that could be limited, not prevented. Guderian drove personally to Hitler's headquarters on approximately the 8th of December to argue for a tactical withdrawal to defensible winter positions. By his own account, in Panzerlieder, written after the war, he brought medical statistics, frostbite numbers, casualty reports, equipment availability figures. Hitler listened and declined. The halt order stood. Guderian was relieved of command on the 26th of December, in part for authorizing local tactical withdrawals that Hitler had expressly forbidden. General Hoepner was dismissed the same week and stripped of his rank and pension, an almost unprecedented humiliation for a senior German officer. Now here is the genuine historiographical tension in the halt order, and I don't want to paper over it with the standard anti-Hitler narrative. Jeffrey Megagi, Robert Citino, and others have argued with some force that the halt order may have prevented the kind of complete disintegration that a general retreat in December-January conditions might have produced. The argument is this: a German army conducting a major retreat in -30 degrees Celsius on inadequate roads, with trucks that wouldn't start and horses dying faster than they could be replaced, without adequate winter clothing or defensive engineer preparation, might have collapsed entirely rather than withdrawn in order. The example of Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812, conducted under roughly similar winter conditions by a similarly exhausted army that was attempting to withdraw, provides a not entirely comforting precedent. Model, who took command of the shattered Ninth Army in January 1942 and stabilized the northern flank by applying the halt order with professional rigor rather than officers' complaint, demonstrated that defensive positions could be held. This inconvenient counter-argument doesn't vindicate Hitler's decision-making as a general proposition, but it does complicate the clean narrative in which the halt order was simply wrong and the generals were simply right. Pearl Harbor. This is the thing no documentary about the Moscow counteroffensive mentions at the right moment, and the timing is too consequential to bury in a footnote. Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941, one day after Zhukov's Western Front joined the counteroffensive. The United States formally entered the war on the 8th. Hitler declared war on America on the 11th of December, 4 days later. This decision, not required by any treaty obligation, opposed privately by several German generals and diplomats, aligned the three largest industrial powers on Earth against Germany within 72 hours of the Moscow counteroffensive beginning. The coincidence in timing is pure accident. The strategic consequence was not. The convergence of these three events, the Soviet counteroffensive on December 5th and 6th, Pearl Harbor on December 7th, Hitler's American Declaration on December 11th, produced in the space of 1 week the fundamental strategic alignment that would determine the war's outcome. Moscow's survival and American entry happened in the same 7 days. Neither caused the other. Both were necessary for the eventual result. Chapter 10. The Generals Who Were Fired Before the Retreat. On the 19th of December 1941, Walter von Brauchitsch submitted what was officially described as his resignation from the post of Commander-in-Chief of the German Army. The resignation cited heart problems. Hitler accepted it immediately and replaced him, not with another general, not with a professional military figure selected through any institutional process, but with himself. The Führer of the Third Reich was now also the direct commanding officer of the German army. The announcement to the Wehrmacht was issued with a sentence appended that has since become one of the most quoted observations in all of Second World War military history, because it reveals with surgical clarity the mindset now at the apex of German military command. The sentence, as documented in OKW records, read approximately, "The little matter of operational leadership is something anyone can do. Anyone can do it." This from the man who had just watched Army Group Center's offensive capability expire, who had just received Wagner's report about the end of all strength, who had just fired his entire senior command structure over a series of weeks in December 1941. Anyone can do operational leadership. The Eastern Front in the winter of 1941 was the universe's response to that assertion. The firing of von Brauchitsch was the capstone of a command purge that consumed the German army's senior leadership across 6 weeks. Von Leeb at Army Group North went. Von Rundstedt at Army Group South had already been relieved in late November after ordering a tactical withdrawal at Rostov that Hitler had forbidden. Von Bock at Army Group Center departed on the 19th of December, officially citing illness. An illness that was real, but whose timing conveniently coincided with a moment when von Bock had privately acknowledged that the offensive was finished. Guderian was dismissed on the 26th of December after ordering local withdrawals his commander had forbidden. Hoppner, commanding 4th Panzer Group, was dismissed the same week, and, in an act that shocked even officers accustomed to Wehrmacht summary justice, was stripped of his rank retroactively, losing his pension and his right to wear the uniform. He had served the German state for decades. Hitler's dismissal notice described his conduct as cowardly. The word was applied to a professional soldier who had commanded armoured forces in Poland, France, and Russia, and who had simply tried to preserve his men's lives by moving them to defensible positions. The man who replaced Guderian at 2nd Panzer Army, and who replaced von Bock, and who stabilized the northern flank of Army Group Center in January, the figure Hitler held up as evidence that his halt order worked, was Walter Model. Model was a different kind of German general. Professionally talented, certainly. But Model's relationship to Hitler was different from Guderian's or Bock's or Höppner's. He was not a product of the pre-war professional military culture that retained, at least residually, an identity separate from the Nazi state. Model was politically reliable in ways that Guderian was conspicuously not. His success in stabilizing the Rzhev salient in January and February 1942 confirmed Hitler's emerging belief that the halt order had been correct, and that the generals who opposed it had been weak. This was a deeply dangerous feedback loop. The evidence that the halt order had been vindicated was provided by a commander selected precisely for his willingness to execute it without the professional friction that had cost Guderian and Höppner their careers. What the December command purge actually accomplished, beyond its immediate personnel consequences, was the permanent removal of the institutional mechanism by which professional military judgment could transmit unwelcome operational realities to Supreme Command. Brauchitsch had been a buffer, an imperfect one, frequently intimidated, sometimes complicit in the suppression of bad news, but still a professional officer standing between Hitler and direct army command. Without that buffer, the chain of command ran directly from division headquarters to Hitler's table. The practical consequence was the expansion of the Führerbefehl system, the requirement for Hitler's personal approval on operational decisions, to include tactical withdrawals at levels previously delegated to divisional commanders. A tactical situation requiring a 15-minute decision was now subject to a communications cycle of 12 to 36 hours minimum in wartime field conditions. The chain had gotten shorter, the decision-making had gotten slower, and the man at the end of the chain was someone who had just described operational leadership as something anyone could do. Von Brauchitsch's departure deserves a moment of biographical attention that it rarely receives, because it illuminates the German military system's failure more precisely than any analysis of strategic decisions. By the time he resigned, Brauchitsch had been conducting the Moscow campaign partly from a sickbed. His heart condition was genuine and had been worsening through the autumn. His personal physician's records, reviewed by military biographer Johannes Hörter, indicate that Brauchitsch had begun drafting withdrawal proposals in November that he never submitted. He didn't submit them because he had watched what happened to officers who contradicted Hitler on operational matters. They were publicly humiliated, dismissed, in some cases stripped of their records and pensions. The Kiev disaster had validated Zhukov's advice and destroyed Zhukov's career simultaneously. The pattern was established. Brauchitsch's medical retirement was, in a very specific sense, the most professionally convenient option available to a man who knew the plan had failed and had no institutional mechanism for saying so. By January of 1942, the front had partially stabilized. Model was holding at Rzhev. The apocalyptic collapse that some German generals had feared, a complete disintegration of Army Group Center, had not occurred. Hitler interpreted this as confirmation of every decision he had made since September. The halt order had worked. The generals who doubted it had been weak. The supply failures had been caused by weather and inadequate subordinate will, not by systemic planning failure. And Halder, the man who had written, "We have underestimated the Russian Colossus," in August, continued to compile his private diary, continued to conduct the OKH's internal analyses, and continued to be present at planning conferences, where the analysis that might have changed something was never fully communicated to the man who needed to hear it. I find this pattern, the accurate private analysis, running alongside the suppressed institutional communication, more disturbing than any specific German military failure. The knowledge existed. The system had been built, by fear and institutional attrition, to prevent it from being used. Chapter 11. The Red Machine, Soviet Industrial Resurrection. While Zhukov was holding Moscow with almost nothing, while German soldiers were burying their frostbitten comrades in frozen earth west of Krasnaya Polyana, while Hitler was firing his generals and declaring himself commander-in-chief of the German army, somewhere in the Ural Mountains, in a partially roofed building in temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius, workers in padded telegraphic jackets were assembling T-34 tanks on a production floor where the walls weren't finished yet. The Kharkov locomotive plant had been the Soviet Union's primary T-34 hull manufacturer. It had been evacuated eastward to the Urals in the chaos of the summer and autumn. Not just the machinery, not just the tools, but the engineers, the skilled workers, the technical documentation, the raw material stocks, and in some cases, the structural steel components of the buildings themselves. The plant had been loaded onto freight wagons, moved approximately 2,000 kilometers east, unloaded at a new industrial site in the city of Nizhny Tagil, and by November of 1941, it was producing tanks again. Under open sky, in winter. Before the roof of the new building was complete, this is not metaphor. Soviet production records and workers' post-war accounts confirm it. The scale of what the Soviet Union accomplished in moving its industrial capacity eastward between June and December of 1941 is one of the most underappreciated operational achievements of the entire war. Partly because it took place behind the front lines, and partly because it doesn't fit easily into any familiar category of military achievement. 1,523 industrial enterprises were relocated eastward in this period, 498 of them from Moscow and the Moscow Oblast specifically. The total mass of machinery, tooling, and equipment moved in these evacuations has been estimated by Soviet economic historians at approximately 10 million tons, roughly 500,000 freight wagon loads. The Soviet rail system moved all of this eastward on a network it was simultaneously using for military resupply, troop movements, and Siberian transfers, under Luftwaffe bombing, while managing the largest active military front in history. The competing demands on Soviet railway capacity in the second half of 1941 constitute one of the most remarkable logistics problems ever solved under fire. The plant complex that the Germans never found a name for, Soviet workers called it Tankergrad, Tank City, was the result of merging the evacuated Kharkov tank factory with the evacuated Leningrad Kirov plant and the existing Chelyabinsk tractor plant in the Urals. By December 1941, this merged complex was producing T-34s at a rate that was already approaching the pre-evacuation output of the original Kharkov facility. The T-34 coming off Tankergrad's lines in November and December of 1941 wasn't identical to the pre-war Kharkov product. Workers' accounts and Soviet engineering records describe slightly looser hull welds in early production runs, a quality compromise consciously accepted in exchange for volume. But the tanks worked. They ran. Their 500 horsepower diesel engines started cold in -30 degrees. Their wide tracks gave them mobility in snow and mud that German armor couldn't match, and they were being produced at a rate that German economic intelligence had declared impossible. The German Armaments Ministry's pre-war estimates projected Soviet tank production, once deprived of its European industrial base, at 500 to 600 units per month at the most optimistic. The actual figure, once the relocated plants reached operating capacity, exceeded 2,000 per month. German economic intelligence had been wrong by a factor of more than 3. The men who made this happen were not the heroic figures that Soviet commemorative literature eventually made them. Several of the industrial managers most responsible for the evacuation's execution were former Gulag prisoners, engineers and economists arrested in the purges of the 1930s, imprisoned for years, and quietly released between 1940 and 41, as Stalin recognized that the war he had spent years denying was imminent and that he needed their expertise more than their incarceration served him. The men who saved Soviet industry from German capture had been prisoners of the Soviet state 5 years earlier. This biographical fact, documented in several post-Soviet memoirs and partially confirmed in archival releases after 1991, was completely suppressed in official Soviet histories of the industrial evacuation. The triumphalist narrative required heroes. Former Gulag prisoners, however skilled and however decisive their contributions, didn't fit the script. German economic intelligence's failure to predict Soviet industrial resilience was rooted not in technical analytical incapacity, but in ideological assumption. The Armaments Ministry's pre-war assessments of Soviet industrial production treated Soviet economic statistics with a particular type of skepticism. The skepticism of a regime that believed the Soviet system was fundamentally inefficient, corrupt, and propped up by propaganda. There was some basis for this. Soviet industrial statistics were routinely inflated, and the gap between official production figures and actual output was real and documented. But the German analysts, in discounting Soviet claims, applied a discount rate derived from their ideological priors about Soviet incompetence, rather than from systematic technical analysis. They underestimated production not because they lacked data, but because they couldn't credit a system they despised with genuine industrial achievement. The bias ran through the analysis. The tanks still came off the lines. The broader economic position of the war, as visible from January of 1942, deserves direct statement because it frames everything that follows. Soviet military production in 1942, the first full year with the relocated factories operating, reached approximately 24,000 tanks, 21,000 aircraft, and over 127,000 artillery pieces of all calibers. German production in the same year reached approximately 4,278 tanks, 14,727 aircraft, and 12,000 artillery pieces. These figures are not a description of a balanced contest between roughly matched industrial powers. They are a description of one side outproducing the other in tanks by a factor of nearly 6, in artillery by a factor of more than 10. Germany would partially close the gap in certain weapons categories in subsequent years, particularly tanks, through qualitative improvements. But the fundamental arithmetic of industrial production was established in 1942, and it ran in one direction. The Battle of Moscow's outcome had opened the time window in which Soviet industry could reconstitute. German forces hadn't closed that window. They'd never really controlled it. Chapter 12. The Counteroffensive Stalls, Stalin's Overreach. There's a document in the sequence of Soviet Stavka records from January of 1942 that tells you more about how the Soviet command system operated than almost anything else in the archive. On the 5th of January, Stalin issued a directive under his authority as People's Commissar of Defense. The operative sentence read, "The Germans are in disarray following their defeat at Moscow. This is a favorable moment to go over to a general offensive." The document was circulated to front commanders. Within 72 hours, according to the archival sequence, Zhukov had submitted a written response. His response included the line, "The Western Front does not have the forces necessary to execute a simultaneous offensive on all sectors." He laid out the supply shortfalls, the ammunition rationing, the transport limitations. He was specific. He was correct. Stalin's reply is not preserved in the archive, or if it is, it hasn't been released. What is preserved is the directive proceeding as drafted, with no modification reflecting Zhukov's objections. The general offensive was ordered. It would proceed on a 1,000-kilometer front from Lake Ladoga to the Crimea, simultaneously, with forces that weren't there. Understanding what happened next requires a brief technical note on Soviet artillery logistics that has rarely been discussed at the level of documentary analysis. The standard Soviet divisional artillery piece in 1941 and 42 was the 122mm howitzer, model 1938. It used semi-fixed ammunition, a design in which the propellant cartridge and the shell body are separate items, loaded independently into the breech, requiring two distinct logistics streams to keep a single weapon firing. Under the pressure of late 1941 production demands, Soviet ordnance factories had prioritized shell body production over propellant cartridge production, creating a situation that seems almost too absurd to be true, but is documented in Soviet supply records. Artillery units in some sectors had adequate shells and insufficient propellant to fire them. The guns existed, the rounds existed, the powder charges didn't exist in sufficient quantities. This specific logistics paradox contributed directly to the artillery shortages Zhukov reported in January and February. The general offensive was launched by an army rationing artillery to 2 or 3 rounds per gun per day in some sectors, numbers consistent with reconnaissance fire, not the sustained preparatory bombardment an offensive operation requires. The Battle of Rzhev began here, in the wreckage of Stalin's general offensive concept, and it is the least discussed major engagement of the entire Eastern Front, discussed less than Stalingrad, less than Kursk, less than any number of smaller operations, despite the fact that its casualty toll over the course of 1942 and the first months of 1943 was by most estimates comparable to or exceeding Stalingrad's. Northwest of Moscow, Soviet armies repeatedly assaulted the German salient centered on the city of Rzhev, attempting to encircle the German forces that had dug into positions there under the halt order. The German defenders, following Hitler's standing directive against withdrawal, had had weeks to construct fieldworks in frozen ground. The Soviet assaults came against prepared defensive positions with inadequate artillery preparation and supply. The results were catastrophic. Casualty ratios in individual Rzhev operations reached proportions that, in other contexts, would have constituted military disasters of the first order. Rzhev was absent from Soviet commemorative history until 1990. Veterans of the campaign describe being told after the war not to discuss it. The state's silence about Rzhev was maintained so completely that many Soviet citizens in the post-war decades were unaware that a major multi-month battle had taken place 70 kilometers northwest of the city that had been the centerpiece of Soviet wartime memory. The debate about Stalin's January general offensive is one where I find myself genuinely split. And I want to say so honestly, rather than giving you a confident verdict. Glantz, whose operational analysis is methodologically careful, treats the January expansion as a miscalculation driven primarily by Stalin's political need to deliver a decisive victory while momentum existed. The supply situation was inadequate. The exploitation of the German culminating point had already been achieved around Moscow, and the attempt to extend the counteroffensive across the entire front consumed Soviet reserves needed for consolidation without producing proportionate results. That argument is persuasive operationally. Ericsson's older but still valuable analysis adds a dimension that Glantz somewhat understates. Even failed Soviet offensives across a 1,000-kilometer front consumed German tactical reserves that would otherwise have been used to stabilize and shorten the line, build winter defensive infrastructure, and prepare for the next seasonal campaign. The failed January attacks were expensive. They were also, from a pure German capacity standpoint, not free. The Wehrmacht spent the winter of 1941 to 42 fighting off Soviet attacks it would have preferred not to deal with while managing the consequences of the Moscow retreat. Both things can be true simultaneously. The general offensive was operationally too ambitious, and it nonetheless imposed costs on the German army that it couldn't easily absorb. What the winter campaign confirmed, by the time the front stabilized in the spring of 1942, was a set of structural realities that neither side had fully absorbed in June of 1941. The Soviet Union was not going to collapse under military pressure the way France had collapsed in 1940. The German army was not going to win a short war of annihilation against a continental power with an industrial base now reconstituting itself beyond the Urals. Moscow had been defended, and the counteroffensive had driven German forces back between 100 and 250 kilometers in some sectors. The front line was now far enough from the capital to remove the immediate strategic threat, but neither side had a clear path to the war's resolution. The Germans were preparing summer operations that would attempt to change the strategic balance by driving toward the Caucasus oil fields, a campaign that would lead, by November of that year, to Stalingrad. The Soviets were mobilizing, producing, and absorbing the lessons of a year of catastrophic military education at the cost of approximately 4 million military casualties. The Battle of Moscow was over. The war had 3 more years to run. Each of those years would be worse than the one before it, in total destruction, if not always in existential danger. December of 1941 had decided something. It hadn't decided everything. Chapter 13. The Generals They Fired. There's a particular kind of document that historians learn to read sideways, not for what it says, but for the gap between the official language and the operational reality underneath. On the 19th of December, 1941, Adolf Hitler signed a brief order accepting the resignation of Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch as Commander-in-Chief of the German Army. The language was courteous. The circumstances were not. Von Brauchitsch had suffered a heart attack on the 20th of November and had been, by every credible account, a commander already stripped of real authority for months. What the document did not say, what no OKW communique would ever say openly, was that Hitler was simultaneously announcing he would replace von Brauchitsch with himself. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The supreme political leader of the Third Reich, with no formal military training beyond 4 years as a corporal and lance corporal in the First World War, assumed personal operational command of roughly 3 million men stretched across a front of nearly 1,000 kilometers in the worst winter in Central European memory. He did not do this quietly. He did it with complete conviction. In a speech to the Reichstag shortly afterward, he described the campaign's difficulties as the product of a surprisingly early severe winter, a phrase that would appear almost verbatim in Führer Directive No. 39, dated the 8th of December, which halted offensive operations and blamed the weather for what was, in documented fact, a logistical catastrophe months in the making. The phrase surprisingly early severe winter is perhaps the most consequential piece of corporate blame shifting in 20th century military history. It appears in documents I've returned to more times than I can count, and every time it strikes me as a monument to willful institutional denial. Von Brauchitsch was not the only one removed. In the 5 weeks between the 1st of December 1941 and the 10th of January 1942, the German army lost, by dismissal, resignation, or forced medical retirement, a number of its most senior commanders with a speed that had no precedent in the modern officer corps of any major power. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, was removed on the 18th of December, officially for health reasons. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, commanding Army Group North, submitted his resignation on the 16th of January 42, after Hitler refused his request to make a tactical withdrawal. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South, had already been dismissed on the 12th of December, after authorizing a retreat from Rostov that he judged operationally necessary. Rundstedt's dismissal sent an unambiguous signal to every German general still in post. The halt order was not a suggestion. The halt order itself, Hitler's directive forbidding large-scale withdrawals and demanding that units hold their current positions whatever the cost, is among the most debated single decisions of the war. I want to be careful here, because the historiographical record is genuinely divided, and the debate isn't simply propaganda versus counter-propaganda. On one hand, a serious body of scholarship, including the work of Rolf Dieter Müller and the German official history Das Deutsche Reich und der Zweite Weltkrieg, argues that the halt order prevented a catastrophic rout. The argument runs roughly as follows. German supply lines were so degraded, German motor transport so depleted. By late November, only about 15% of authorized truck strength remained operational across Army Group Center, that a general retreat would have meant abandoning most of the army's remaining equipment. Without equipment, troops on foot in minus 25-degree temperatures would have died in their hundreds of thousands. Holding fortified positions, however uncomfortable, was at least survivable. On the other hand, a competing body of evidence suggests the halt order prolonged suffering without strategic benefit, and that more flexible, tactically competent withdrawals to better prepared defensive lines would have saved both men and materiel. Guderian's memoir, Panzer Leader, published in English in 1950, is the most famous articulation of this view. Guderian writes with barely concealed fury about the decision, framing it as an interference with professional military judgment by a man incapable of understanding ground conditions. Historians have rightly noted that Guderian was writing in retrospect, with reputational stakes in play, and that his accounts of specific conversations are not always corroborated by contemporaneous documents. The friction between Guderian's memoir and the war diary of the Second Panzer Army is real and worth acknowledging rather than papering over. What is not in dispute is the scale of the command purge. 35 generals were relieved of their commands in December alone. Among them was General Erich Höppner, commander of the 4th Panzer Group, who authorized an unauthorized local withdrawal near Moscow in January 42, was dismissed by Hitler personally, stripped of his rank, his right to wear his uniform, and his pension. Höppner's case became a cause célèbre in German officer circles, not because they objected to the dismissal on legal grounds. The Wehrmacht's legal framework gave Hitler extraordinary powers, but because it stripped away the last fiction that professional judgment had any protected standing. You could be right. You could save your men. You could still lose everything. General Walter Model, who replaced several of the dismissed commanders in rapid succession, became the exemplary figure of the new order. A commander who combined tactical competence with absolute personal loyalty to Hitler's directives. Model's ferocious defense of the Rzhev salient through all of 1942 would cost the Red Army losses that were, by some estimates, comparable to Stalingrad. Losses that Soviet censors buried for decades. There is a quiet irony in the fact that the command purge, which looked from the outside like decisive leadership, was in operational terms a form of institutional self-harm. The generals who were removed, whatever their individual failings, had spent their careers studying combined arms warfare. Their replacements were selected, in significant part, for willingness to hold ground regardless of tactical cost. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, who replaced von Kluge on Army Group Center in 1943, is a figure who appears in almost no popular history of the war, and yet his obedient implementation of Hitler's hold everything doctrine contributed directly to the catastrophic collapse at Army Group Center in June 1944. Operation Bagration, the largest single defeat of German arms in the entire war. The dismissals of December 1941 were not merely the end of a battle. They were a structural event whose consequences ran forward 3.5 years. I keep returning to a single detail in the OKH personnel records from this period. The paperwork for the dismissals is, in many cases, scrupulously neat, typed, properly formatted, signed in the correct places. In the middle of a catastrophic military collapse, in the worst winter in decades, someone in Berlin was filing the forms correctly. There's something about that particular kind of bureaucratic punctuality in the middle of disaster that I find deeply unsettling, not because it's surprising, but because it's so recognizably human. The institution keeps functioning, even as the thing the institution was built to do falls apart. The command changes did not stabilize the front on their own. What stabilized the front, partially, imperfectly, at enormous cost, was the exhaustion of the Soviet counteroffensive's operational reach. By late January 42, the Red Army's leading divisions had outrun their own supply lines. Their rifle companies were down to 40 or 50 men from an authorized strength of nearly 200, and they were pushing against a German defensive line that, for all its improvisation, was backed by a rail system that could now move a modest but functional flow of ammunition and reinforcement. The front did not stop moving because Hitler's willpower held it. It stopped moving because both sides had reached the limits of what their logistics could sustain at that distance from a functioning railhead. The historiographical problem with December 1941 is that it attracted myth-making from every direction almost immediately. German officers, writing in American captivity or in post-war memoirs, needed a narrative that preserved their professional honor while explaining defeat. The Hitler overruled us framework served that purpose admirably. Soviet historians needed a narrative of heroic popular resistance under wise party leadership. Western historians, writing in the Cold War context, often needed the battle to fit into a story about either the decisive role of Allied supply or the irredeemable criminality of the Nazi system. None of these frameworks are simply false. All of them are partial. The actual events were more complicated, more contingent, and more dependent on accumulated logistical failures than any single cause explanation can accommodate. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. By the end of January 1942, The German army had suffered approximately 174,000 casualties in the Battle of Moscow. That figure is from the German army's own monthly casualty reports, and while there are methodological debates about what categories of loss were included, the order of magnitude is not seriously contested. The Red Army had suffered losses that were substantially higher. Krivosheyev's 1993 statistical study, based on Soviet military archives, gives a figure of roughly 1,280,000 total casualties for the Moscow defensive and offensive operations combined, of which approximately 360,000 were dead or missing. Those numbers were not published in the Soviet Union for decades. The official commemorative figures used in anniversary ceremonies were systematically lower. The gap between the commemorative number and the archival number is itself a historical document, one that tells you something important about the political economy of memory in a system that could not afford to let grief become grievance. Chapter 14. The Winter That Wasn't the Point. Let me tell you what General Winter actually was, because the phrase has done more damage to serious historical understanding of the Eastern Front than almost any other single piece of folklore, and it needs to be taken apart carefully. The phrase implies a straightforward causal mechanism. Extreme cold disabled German forces, protected Soviet forces, and thereby determined the outcome of the battle. It's clean, it's memorable, it fits on a poster. It is also, in every important technical detail, wrong. Or rather, it mistakes a multiplier for a cause, and that distinction matters enormously. Here is what the temperatures actually were in the Moscow theatre in the autumn and early winter of 1941. The first hard frost arrived in early November. By mid-November, temperatures in the forward areas were regularly reaching -15 to -20 degrees Celsius. In the first week of December, they dropped further, to -25 to -30 in some sectors. Those are severe temperatures, particularly for men in summer weight uniforms. They are not, however, outside the normal range of Central Russian winters. They are also not, by any technical standard, the primary reason the German supply system failed. The supply system had failed before the frost arrived. I want to be precise about this because the chronology matters. The first phase of the Soviet autumn counterattack, the mud season, the rasputitsa, which lasted roughly from the second week of October through most of November, did more damage to German motor transport and road capacity than the subsequent frost. The mud reduced average daily truck deliveries in Army Group Center's supply zone from roughly 23 sorties per vehicle per day to approximately 4. It immobilized artillery that could not be moved off unpaved roads. It killed horses by the thousands, because horses standing in mud for days develop hoof infections that kill them faster than cold does. By the 1st of November, Army Group Center's supply deficit stood at approximately 102,000 tons relative to minimum operational requirements. That deficit existed in the absence of significant frost. The freezing of the ground in mid-November was, in one sense, actually helpful to German logistics in the short term. It solidified roads that had been impassable mud tracks. It allowed vehicles to move again. The number of supply trains reaching Army Group Center increased from roughly 8 per day in the mud season to something in the low 20s by late November, still far below the requirement of 24 trains per day that the Army's own logistics staff had calculated, but measurably better than October. If General Winter were the primary cause of German failure, you would expect logistics to have gotten worse as temperatures dropped. In the period immediately following the freeze, they briefly improved. What the cold did do, and this is real, documented, and important, was accelerate the physical degradation of men and equipment that had already been operating beyond their sustainable limits for 3 months. The standard German military lubricants of 1941 had been formulated for use in Central European conditions. In temperatures below -15, the hydraulic fluids in Panzer main guns congealed. breach mechanisms became unreliable. Vehicle engines that were not kept running continuously overnight would not start in the morning, which required running engines through the night, which consumed fuel that the supply system could barely provide. Artillery shells became brittle and prone to premature detonation. Optics fogged and froze. The K-98 rifle could be operated in extreme cold without modification, but the MG-34 machine gun, the standard German section fire support weapon, required a cold-weather lubricant that had not been issued in adequate quantities. Units were improvising with cooking oil and, in some documented cases, urine. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were not immune to the cold, but they were substantially better prepared for it. The felt boot, the Valenki, was a piece of footwear technology so well adapted to extreme cold that it remains in use in the Russian military today. German soldiers who encountered Soviet prisoners in November and December 1941 were frequently documented noting the quality of the Soviet winter uniforms, with a mixture of professional admiration and bitter resentment. Sergeant-level German after-action reports from this period, the kind of document that rarely makes it into popular histories, but is immensely valuable precisely because it wasn't written for an audience, repeatedly mention frostbite as the proximate cause of unit combat ineffectiveness. The German Army's own medical records show approximately 100,000 cold-weather casualties on the Eastern Front by the end of 1941, with over 14,000 requiring amputations. Some divisions reported more frostbite cases in a single week than battle casualties in the preceding month. The contrast is not between a cold-immune Soviet army and a cold-destroyed German one. It is between two armies operating in the same conditions, one of which had been given the equipment, training, and logistical support to function in those conditions, and one of which had not. The decision not to issue winter equipment to the Wehrmacht in the summer of 1941 was not made because the German High Command was unaware that Russia had winters. It was made because issuing winter equipment would have been an acknowledgement that the campaign would last into winter, and an acknowledgement that the campaign would last into winter was politically unacceptable. The supply failure and the equipment failure were both downstream of the same original decision. The assumption, encoded into every planning document and every logistics calculation, that the Soviet Union would collapse before the autumn. When that assumption proved wrong, the entire structure of German operational planning had no recovery mechanism because the planning structure had been built on a premise that did not permit the question, what do we do if this takes longer than expected, to be asked seriously. This is the technical reality behind the phrase General Winter. It was not that winter came and defeated a functioning army. It was that winter arrived as the final multiplier in a cascade of failures that had begun in June. The underestimation of Soviet depth, the failure of encirclement battles to produce strategic paralysis, the breakdown of the railway conversion program, the mud, the horse mortality, the fuel arithmetic that never balanced. Winter didn't cause those failures, it made them fatal. The German soldiers' experience of this, and we have enough letters, diaries, and unit accounts to reconstruct it in meaningful detail, without inventing anything, was one of progressive bewilderment at a campaign that didn't end when it was supposed to end. The standard-issue German infantry soldier of 1941 had been told, in one form or another, that this would be over quickly. The intelligence briefings, the commanding officers' addresses to the troops, the newspaper coverage back home, all of it was calibrated to a short campaign. By October, soldiers were writing letters that expressed a particular kind of cognitive dissonance. Pride in what they had accomplished, combined with a growing unease about a situation that their mental model of the war could not accommodate. By December, some letters expressed something closer to exhaustion and fear. Not panic. The German soldiers' discipline and unit cohesion remained remarkably intact relative to what the objective situation warranted, but a kind of grey, grinding tiredness that is one of the most consistent emotional textures in the Eastern Front primary sources. The myth of General Winter serves a function, and it's worth understanding what that function is. For German veterans and their post-war advocates, it externalized the defeat. Nature did this, not human error or moral failure. For Soviet and Russian commemorative culture, it fit a satisfying narrative of the motherland defended by its own elements. For Western popular history, it offered a clean explanation that didn't require engagement with the genuinely complex logistics story. The problem is that myths that serve emotional needs are not therefore false in every particular. The cold did matter. The Soviet winter equipment was genuinely superior. The German equipment failures were real. But they can mislead you profoundly about causation. And causation is what you need to understand if you want to understand what actually happened and why. I'll say this plainly. I think the winter myth is, at this point in historiography, mostly a problem of popular culture rather than serious scholarship. The academic literature on the Eastern Front logistics, Martin van Creveld's Supplying War, the German official history, the work of David Glantz and Jonathan House, the more recent scholarship on Soviet mobilization, has been fairly clear for decades that the winter was a multiplier on a pre-existing failure. The battle in popular culture, though, still tends to be told as a story about frozen panzer engines and heroic Soviet defenders in white camouflage. Both of those things are real. Neither of them is the point. Chapter 15. What Moscow meant. The strategic stakes. Moscow was 11 train stations. That is one of the least poetic and most important facts about the battle, and it tends to get buried under the weight of ideological significance that both German and Soviet narratives attach to the city's name. By 1941, Moscow was the hub of a rail network whose spokes ran in 9 principal directions: northwest toward Leningrad, west toward Smolensk and the front, southwest toward Bryansk, south toward Tula and Kursk, southeast toward Voronezh, east toward the Urals and the industrial cities beyond them, northeast toward Yaroslavl, north toward Vologda and Archangel, and northwest again toward Kalinin. No other city in the Soviet Union sat at the intersection of that many major rail lines. The next most important rail hub was perhaps Yaroslavl or Voronezh, neither of which connected the country's industrial geography in anything approaching the same way. This matters because the industrial evacuation of the Soviet Union, the program that moved 1,523 enterprises east of the Urals between July and December of 1941, that shifted something on the order of 10 million tons of machine tools, turbines, lathes, rolling mills, and specialist equipment, ran through Moscow's rail network. Not all of it. The southern corridor via Voronezh carried some of the traffic, but a very large fraction of the most critical industrial freight moved through or past Moscow. The disruption of that network, even its partial disruption, would have imposed cascading delays on an evacuation program that was already operating at the edge of physical capacity. In November and December of 41, while the battle for the city's outer defenses was being fought, Soviet trains were still moving east through Moscow's marshalling yards. The two things were happening simultaneously, and the city's rail function was not interrupted. Now I want to think carefully about the counterfactual, because it's important, and also because it's the kind of speculation that historians approach with varying degrees of willingness and varying degrees of rigor. If German forces had seized Moscow in October or November of 1941, which would have required at minimum that the logistical problems had been solved, which would have required at minimum that the planning assumptions about Soviet collapse had been correct, what would have actually happened? This is not a question with a certain answer, but we can reason about it from what we know. The Soviet government had planned to relocate to Kubyshev on the Volga. The NKVD had prepared demolition charges on Moscow's infrastructure. The GKO emergency document number 34, dated the 15th of October 41, had designated which industrial assets would be destroyed rather than captured. None of this is speculation. It is documented. A German occupation of Moscow would therefore not have found the city's infrastructure intact and usable. What it would have done, almost certainly, is sever the rail connections in all 9 directions at their common node, creating a logistics crisis for the Soviet war effort at precisely the moment when the eastern factories were beginning production. The Urals tank factories that began producing T-34s in significant numbers in early 1942 would have been geographically safe, but logistically isolated from the front in ways that would have been extremely difficult to manage. There is also the question of political and symbolic effect, which historians sometimes treat as secondary to operational factors, but which was, in this specific case, genuinely operationally significant. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow, announced implicitly by his presence at the November 7th parade and explicitly in the tone of Soviet public communications from late October onward, was a political choice with direct military consequences. It gave local commanders a clear signal about the level of resistance expected. It committed NKVD blocking detachments to enforcement of that resistance on terms that would not be negotiated. It told Soviet soldiers, in the bluntest possible terms, that there was no approved alternative to fighting. Whether that political context affected individual decisions to fight or flee is ultimately unknowable at the individual level, but the aggregate effect on Soviet defensive cohesion in November 41 appears, from the operational record, to have been real. The debate about whether Moscow was really the critical strategic objective, as opposed to, say, the industrial regions of Ukraine or the oil fields of the Caucasus, is one that serious historians have engaged with at length, and it has not produced consensus. Hitler's own stated rationale for the Kiev diversion in August 41, that the economic resources of Ukraine were essential prerequisites for a sustained war effort, was not strategically incoherent. The Donbass coal and the Ukrainian agricultural capacity were genuinely important. The argument that Moscow should have been struck first, before the diversions of August and September, rests partly on a strategic assessment and partly on a logistical one. That only in July and August was the Wehrmacht's supply situation good enough to sustain a direct drive on Moscow, and that the window closed as the mud season approached. What's underappreciated in popular accounts, and what the operational record makes fairly clear, is that by the time Operation Typhoon was launched on the 2nd of October 41, the question of whether Moscow could be seized before winter was already close to being decided. Decided by the supply deficit, by the railway conversion lag, by the attrition of panzer strength across 3 months of unprecedented operational tempo. The encirclement victories at Viasma and Bryansk were genuinely catastrophic for the Red Army. They were not enough. The German army that emerged from the Viasma pocket in late October was not the same army that had crossed the Soviet border in June. It was thinner, more tired, more dependent on improvisation, and operating at the end of a supply chain that could deliver, in the most optimistic accounting, about 1/3 of minimum requirements. The historical verdict, and I use that phrase knowing it implies more finality than the evidence strictly supports, is that the Battle of Moscow was the first moment when the gap between German strategic ambition and German operational capacity became visible in a way that could not be managed by tactical brilliance or individual unit heroism. This is not what German military culture was designed to process. The German officer corps' self-understanding was built around the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-oriented tactics, which gave junior commanders enormous flexibility to achieve assigned objectives using their own judgment. That system worked extraordinarily well when the objectives were achievable. It had no internal mechanism for signaling upward when the objectives were not achievable, because the culture treated that kind of upward signal as an admission of failure rather than as operational information. Zhukov, watching from the Soviet side, understood what was happening. His memoir, even in the version available in the West, which was censored and revised in ways that post-Soviet archival work has partially untangled, shows a commander who was tracking the German supply situation as carefully as the German order of battle. He knew that the panzer groups running out of fuel east of Kalinin in mid-November were not going to be replenished quickly. He knew that the German offensive's culminating point, the moment at which attack transitions to exhaustion, was approaching. His operational art consisted, in significant part, of holding Moscow's defenses just long enough for that culminating point to arrive, and then hitting as hard as possible on the morning of the 5th of December, before the Germans could reorganize, dig in properly, and restore their supply situation. In that sense, the Battle of Moscow is a story about time, about the relationship between operational ambition and the calendar, about what happens when a planning assumption about duration proves catastrophically wrong, and no one in the system has the authority or the institutional standing to say so. Chapter 16. The Myth Machine. How the Battle was Remembered. History is never just what happened. It is always also what the people who survived it needed it to have meant. The Battle of Moscow, in the decades after 1945, became one of the most intensively mythologized events of the Second World War. And the mythologizing happened simultaneously in at least 3 distinct political and cultural contexts: Soviet, German, and Western, each of which produced a version of events tailored to its own psychological and ideological needs. Understanding those versions, and understanding where they diverge from the documentary record, is not a minor scholarly exercise. It is essential to understanding why the battle is still misunderstood. The Soviet version was constructed almost immediately, in parallel with the fighting. The November 7th parade, Red Army units marching across Red Square past Stalin, then directly to the front, was filmed and broadcast in a way that was explicitly designed to produce a specific set of images for propaganda purposes. Stalin's speech that day has been quoted many times. What is less often noted is that the archival and memoir record about the preceding weeks, the panic of mid-October, the evacuation orders, the burning of documents, the NKVD shootings of looters in Moscow streets, was systematically excluded from the official account. The gap between the October panic and the November parade was, in Soviet public history, simply not there. The suppression went further. The Rzhev battles of 1942 and 43, the direct operational consequence of Stalin's January 42 decision to extend the Moscow counteroffensive far beyond the point of operational sustainability, produced Soviet casualties that Krivashev's archival study estimates at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million, depending on which operations are included in the accounting. These battles were not commemorated in Soviet military history in proportion to their scale. Veterans who had fought at Rzhev reported, in interviews conducted after the Soviet collapse, that they had been explicitly discouraged from speaking publicly about the losses. The ratio of monuments to casualties at Rzhev is strikingly low compared to battles of similar or lesser scale that fit more comfortably into the narrative of inevitable Soviet triumph. The German mythologization operated on a different register. The memoir literature produced by senior German commanders in the late 1940s and the 1950s, Guderian's Panzer Leader, Erich von Manstein's Lost Victories, Albert Kesselring's A Soldier's Record, established what later scholars would call the clean Wehrmacht narrative. A professional army defeated not by military error or strategic misjudgment, but by Hitler's interference with expert judgment and by the unreasonable extremity of Russian conditions. This narrative served multiple functions simultaneously. It preserved the professional honor of the officer class. It provided a marketable explanation for defeat that did not implicate the army as an institution in the criminal activities of the Nazi regime. and it found a ready audience in the American and British military establishments, which had immediate professional reasons to view the German officer corps as competent partners in understanding Soviet military capacity. The Wehrmacht exhibition of 1995 and its revised version of 1999 and 2001 represented the most significant public rupture with the clean Wehrmacht myth in German cultural life. The exhibition documented, using photographs, letters, and operational records, the Wehrmacht's direct participation in atrocities on the Eastern Front, the murder of Jews, the mass starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, the burning of villages. The reaction in Germany was intense and divided in ways that are themselves a historical document. The fact that the exhibition required two versions, the first was withdrawn after some photographs were misidentified, which became the focus of attacks on the entire project, tells you something about the institutional stakes involved in revising this particular narrative. The Western version of the battle's memory is in some ways the most interesting, precisely because it was the most diffuse and the least politically organized. In American and British popular history, the Battle of Moscow tended to appear as prologue, a prelude to Stalingrad, which was the battle that Western audiences absorbed as the real turning point of the Eastern Front. There are reasons for this that go beyond simple ignorance. Stalingrad has a more legible narrative shape: encirclement, siege, counter-encirclement, surrender. It has a more compact geography. It produced the dramatic image of Field Marshal Paulus surrendering in a basement, which translated directly into the visual grammar of documentary film. The Battle of Moscow, spread over 6 months, across a front of 600 kilometers, involving dozens of separate operations and a cast of thousands of named commanders, resists the kind of narrative compression that popular history requires. The result is a persistent underestimation of the Battle of Moscow's significance in Western popular understanding of the war. The battle is described in most English-language popular accounts as Hitler's first defeat, which is accurate, but does little to convey the scale of what actually occurred or why it mattered. The more technically precise formulation, that Moscow was the point at which the structural mismatch between German strategic ambition and German operational capacity became definitively visible, requires a level of engagement with logistics and planning documents that popular narrative tends to avoid. There is also the question of what defeat means at Moscow, and the answer is less clean than the phrase Hitler's first defeat implies. The Germans were pushed back, but not destroyed. Army Group Center retained its basic organizational coherence. The front stabilized by February 42 at positions that were roughly where the Germans had stood in late October. The Soviet counteroffensive did not achieve the annihilation of the German armies that Stalin's January 42 orders had projected. The battle ended not in a decisive Soviet operational triumph, but in a mutual exhaustion, after which both sides reorganized for what turned out to be 4 more years of war. The claim that Moscow was Hitler's first defeat is accurate in the sense that it was the first major German offensive operation that failed to achieve its strategic objective. It is misleading if it implies a clean, decisive Soviet victory of the kind that Stalingrad represented. What I find most significant about the memory of the battle, and this is a reflection, not a citation, is the way it became, almost immediately, a story about individuals rather than systems. Stalin's decision to stay, Zhukov's command, the Siberian divisions, the frozen panzers. These are all real elements of the historical picture, but organizing the story around them allows the audience to avoid the more uncomfortable and more important structural question. How does a planning system generate an operational plan that contains no mechanism for questioning its own foundational assumptions? That question is not specific to 1941 Germany. It is a question about how institutions process unwelcome information. And it is as relevant in 2026 as it was in the planning rooms of the OKH in the spring of 1941. Chapter 17. The Long Shadow. From Moscow to Now. The Soviet counteroffensive that began on the 5th of December 1941 and ground to an exhausted halt in late February 1942 did not end the war. It did not even end the war on the Eastern Front in any but the most provisional sense. By the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht had largely stabilized its lines, conducted a degree of tactical reorganization that was impressive given the conditions of the preceding winter, and was already planning the summer offensive that would drive south toward the Volga and the Caucasus. The Battle of Moscow was not the end of anything except the possibility of German victory in a single campaign season. Everything that followed, Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, Berlin, was the downstream consequence of a war that Moscow ensured would continue. That continuation cost a number of human lives, whose scale I want to try to convey without reduction to abstraction. The total Soviet military and civilian deaths in the Second World War are estimated, in the most careful post-Soviet demographic work, at somewhere between 26 and 28 million. The German military dead, including the Waffen-SS, and including losses on all fronts, were approximately 5.5 million. The occupied territories of Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, suffered losses whose percentage of pre-war population exceeded those of any Western European country by factors of 5, 10, or more. The Battle of Moscow itself, in the 6 months between October 41 and March 42, cost the Red Army approximately 1,200,000 casualties. The German army suffered approximately 174,000 in the same period. These numbers were produced by specific decisions, made by identifiable people, about how to organize armies, supply chains, and political systems. The battle's most durable technical legacy is perhaps the logistics lesson, which was studied intensively by military planners on both sides throughout the remaining years of the war, and which has continued to shape military operational theory in ways that are not always visible in popular accounts of strategic history. The fundamental problem that destroyed German operational capacity at Moscow, the gap between the length of the operational reach projected by the plan and the capacity of the supply system to sustain that reach, is not a problem specific to the German army in 1941. It is a structural feature of extended land warfare that every major power has encountered in varying forms in every large-scale campaign since. The American logistics experience in the European theatre in 1944, specifically the supply crisis that followed the breakout from Normandy and produced the competing operational plans of Montgomery and Patton, is directly shaped by staff officers who had studied the German experience at Moscow and on the Eastern Front generally. The railway question deserves a moment of specific attention, because it is one of the places where the technical detail yields the most historiographical return. The German army's inability to rapidly convert Soviet broad-gauge railways to standard European gauge, a process that could be accomplished at approximately 20 kilometers of track per day under optimal conditions, far slower than the operational advance, meant that every kilometer of forward progress beyond the existing converted network increased the truck transport burden by a corresponding increment. The mathematics were simple, and they were documented in the planning files. The question of why the operational planners proceeded regardless is one that does not have a satisfying single-cause answer. The short version is that the planning culture within the OKH did not have an effective mechanism for allowing logistics constraints to override operational ambitions. The logistical tail was understood as a problem to be managed, not as a hard limit on what was strategically possible. This is a lesson that military historians tend to describe as having been learned from the Eastern Front, and in a narrow technical sense, post-war NATO military planning did internalize supply line depth as a genuine operational constraint rather than an afterthought. Whether that institutional learning persists through the kind of cultural and generational turnover that organizations inevitably experience is a different question, and one that the events of February 2022 provided some unexpected data about. When Russian armored columns advanced on Kiev in the opening days of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they were observed by military analysts, by journalists, and eventually in satellite imagery, to have run out of fuel. Long columns of vehicles sat stationary on roads north of the Ukrainian capital, while fuel trucks that were supposed to support them failed to arrive. The reasons for that failure were multiple and debated, but one structural element was familiar. A logistics system that had been calibrated to an assumption about how quickly the operation would succeed, and that had no effective recovery mechanism for the scenario in which that assumption proved wrong. I want to be careful about this parallel, because history rarely repeats in the clean way that analogy implies, and military historians rightly resist over-schematic comparisons. The German army of 1941 and the Russian army of 2022 operated in different technological, political, and doctrinal contexts. The distances involved were different. The enemy they faced was different in every important particular. But the structural pattern, operational planning calibrated to an optimistic assumption about duration, logistics system with no slack, failure to update the plan when the assumption proved wrong, political constraints on the upward communication of operational problems, is recognizable across the 60-year gap. The Battle of Moscow is not merely a historical event. It is a case study in a failure mode that is, evidently, not self-correcting. Zelensky's decision to remain in Kiev in the first days of the Russian invasion, refusing evacuation, recording a video from a street in central Kiev with his cabinet, saying in Ukrainian that they were all here, was compared by numerous commentators in real time to Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow in October 1941. The comparison is imperfect in many ways. The political systems were entirely different. The degrees of personal danger were different. The communications technologies were different in ways that made the political effect of the decision more immediate and more globally visible. But the functional parallel is real. In both cases, a political leader's visible presence in a threatened capital changed the operational calculus for the defenders and the attacker simultaneously. Stalin's presence in Moscow in October 41 was not, in itself, what saved the city. Neither was Zelensky's presence in Kiev what determined the outcome of the Russian advance. In both cases, though, the decision to stay rather than flee was a significant input into a complex system. And in both cases, the outcome was different from what the attacker had projected. The Battle of Moscow remains, 84 years on, a contested historical event in ways that more formally resolved battles are not. The casualty figures still carry methodological uncertainty. The relative weight of different causal factors, logistics, winter, Soviet mobilization, Siberian transfers, Sorga's intelligence, Stalin's psychological state, Zhukov's operational art, is still genuinely debated among serious historians, rather than settled by consensus. The question of whether the halt order helped or harmed the German army's prospects, examined closely, does not have a clean answer that one side of the debate can win decisively. These unresolved questions are not a failure of the historical record. They are a feature of the historical record. Evidence that the events were genuinely complex, genuinely contingent, and genuinely resistant to the simplified narratives that all of us, when we're tired or in need of a clear story, are tempted to prefer. The men who fought this battle, Soviet and German, regular and militia, officer and private, those who survived and those who did not, were not figures in a parable. They were human beings operating under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress, making decisions within constraints that were not of their making, dying or surviving through combinations of skill, discipline, luck, and the particular accident of which sector of front they happen to occupy at which moment. The documents they left, the diaries, the after-action reports, the letters home, the medical records, the supply requisitions, the casualty lists, are what we have. They are enough to tell a complicated story. They are not enough to tell a complete one. That incompleteness is not something to apologize for. It is the honest state of the historical record for any event this large and this old. What the record does support, with reasonable confidence, is the following. In the autumn and winter of 1941, on a 600-kilometer front in central Russia, the German army reached the operational limit of a plan built on false assumptions, and the Soviet army, at enormous cost, held long enough to make that limit fatal. The war continued for 3.5 more years. Moscow was not the end. It was the place where the question of whether the war had an end other than German victory was first answered. Quietly, at enormous cost, without ceremony, in the frozen mud east of Klin and north of Tula, and along the railway embankments of a transport network that was still, improbably, running trains. That is where we stop. Not because the story is over. It isn't. Not in the historical sense, and perhaps not in the contemporary sense either. But because this is the point at which the question that this documentary has been circling since the first chapter finally has an answer, even if it's not the clean, decisive answer that dramatic narrative prefers. The answer is, it held. By the narrowest of margins, through the accumulated weight of logistical failure and Soviet endurance, it held. That is enough.